A couple years ago, I did a series called William Lane Craig, Idiot or Willful Piece of Cake. Wait, what did you think the bleeped out four-letter word was? In which I discussed the disconnect between the implausible stupidity of practically everything Craig says and the skill with which he says it, posing the question of whether this gap exists because Craig is just an idiot or because he in fact is a manipulative, opportunist piece of cake. And while in hindsight I'd have picked a less crude, abrasive approach, the core point still stands. But that was addressing Craig in his prime, when his delivery was precise enough to cloak his utter stupidity in the trappings of academic credibility. What this video is about is Craig now, a Craig who I'd suggest is past his prime. Now I could see this video accused of being an attempt to avoid confronting him at his best while going after the low-hanging fruit of his current addled ramblings. But that's not my intention, because the point is that Craig at his best was never good to begin with. He was always about style over substance, and now that he's gotten worse at presenting with style, it's just easier to see how bad the substance always was. To employ a lovely metaphor, I'm not mocking a formerly skilled chocolatier who started slipping and selling people turds in his old age. I'm showing how a devious chocolatier was always selling turds coated with chocolate and, with age, got worse at coating them so that now everybody sees their turds. So today I'm taking a look at Craig's recent progress by sampling some of the short videos that have been posted to the Dr. Craig Videos channel. I'll start with the most recent one titled, Did All of Jesus' Crucifixion Scars Transfer to His Post-Resurrection Body? A question Craig answers like this.
I don't think that we should infer that. When you look at the image of the man on the Shroud of Turin, he is covered with horrible abuse. And there's no reason to think that Jesus took that into his eternal state. But it does say that he kept the wounds in his hands and feet and in his side. And I love this feature of the resurrection narratives, because to me, these wounds are, as it were, trophies of Christ's victory over sin and death and hell that is represented by the cross. Augustine framed it so well. He said, Victor quia victima. He is the victor because he is the victim. And so these crucifixion wounds are tokens that Jesus doesn't leave behind, but takes on into eternity as trophies of his conquest on the cross.
Now the most striking thing here is this is a shockingly weird thing to talk about, and Craig comes off as pretty weird talking about it. Now yeah, it was posed to him as a question, so it's not like he instigated the topic, but maybe he could have just said, I have no way in the world of knowing and it's not relevant to anything? That would have been a good answer. But instead, Craig spends a full minute babbling his way to some bizarre, baseless conclusions. This sounds moronic on the level of how many angels could dance on the head of a pin, and my favorite part of this video is watching the guy in the lower right who looks like he starts off laughing at the question, and then switches to looking like he's both baffled and trying to keep a reverent expression on his face. I don't know, maybe it's my imagination. But there are a couple telling things here that illuminate how Craig operated even at his prime. First is the arbitrary path he takes in reasoning his way to a conclusion he has no way of knowing anything about. He starts by saying there's no reason to think Jesus would have taken all his wounds with him, which I guess is true, but then there's also no reason to think the opposite, so it's a pretty silly basis to even tentatively start reasoning from, then decides that since the Bible does record some wounds, he likes the idea that these are trophies of his victory. Now, of course, this is arguably just lighthearted speculation about an idea that appeals to him, and that's fine. But the fact that he takes such liberties in establishing his premises, and then indulges in the kind of loose, undisciplined reasoning we see here is telling. And more to the point, it's just a more transparent version of the shortcuts he's always taken, even when he is proposing a solid logical argument. It's reminiscent of what I consider the weakest link in his old scripted debate routine, which is his attempt at reasoning to the conclusion that the universe had to have come from a conscious being.
There must have been a cause which brought the universe into being. Now, as the cause of space and time, this being must be an uncaused, timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well. Why? Because the cause must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only two kinds of things that fit that description. Either an abstract object, like numbers, or else a personal mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the cause of the universe is a transcendent, intelligent mind.
It's embarrassingly obvious that he had no way of assuming these things about whatever unknown phenomena might have caused the universe, if anything even did in any sense we'd intuitively understand, just as it's embarrassingly obvious that he has no clue about the state of Jesus' resurrected body. It just sticks out more in the second case because the topic is weird and insignificant, and he's less articulate in selling his leaps of logic. The second thing you might have picked up on is how he threw in a Latin quote, something that might have made him sound like an erudite sophisticate in his prime, but here comes off as a more obviously pretentious interjection, both because of the contrast to the foolishness of what he's talking about, and because it serves no purpose other than to give Craig a chance to show that he knows a Latin phrase. It just feels more jarring to me than his way of slipping in name droppings and allusions in his prime. Now, if that came off as nitpicking over something that wasn't meant to be a solid argument, let's look at a few short videos that were. Each of these is an argument he's made in one form or another before, and they were bad then just as they are now. But in these cases, he slips up and owns himself by revealing clear, often explicitly stated gaps in his own reasoning. Now, does he really slip up worse than before? I don't know. Maybe it's just me, and maybe you can find examples of him being just as bad in his prime. But these clips are equally revealing either way. First is a video called, "Could God Issue a Drive Out the Canaanites command today?" Not only is this topic an oldie but a goodie, but it's illuminating to address Old Testament horrors by asking, what would you do today? So let's see how Craig answers. Surely he's going to talk his way around a yes answer by saying something about the Old Covenant or,
I don't see why God couldn't issue such a command today.
ooh, well, that's extremely uncool. But I guess let's let him finish before we judge him too harshly.
That's what she said.
Think of World War II and what was happening in
1940s
Germany. Why couldn't God issue a command to the nations of the free world to invade Germany and drive out or exterminate the
1940s Germans?
I don't see why he couldn't do that.
Because we don't drive people out of their homelands and exterminate them? I mean, I get what he's trying to do here. The 1940s government did horrifying things, so the Allied response is generally approved of as an act of liberation. But, and it pains me to have to explain this, so I'll keep it short, we look favorably upon it because the Allied forces were stopping a mass extermination, and they generally used measured military intervention. When they did become excessive in their use of force, the firebombing of Dresden or the brutal retaliation of the Soviets being just two famous examples, history judges them for it. And we have a totally different opinion of what happened if they'd gone in and wiped out every man, woman, and child in Germany. So Craig's analogy is embarrassingly absurd. By suddenly throwing the terms drive out or exterminate into his description of what the Allies might have done to the 1940s Germans, he's taking things to a jarringly dark place, making it obvious how desperately he's trying to force two vastly different actions into an analogy. It's sad and, for a wordsmith of Craig's caliber, amazingly artless. Also, on a side note, it's interesting that God never gave that command, and thus countless people died while the U.S. remained neutral. I guess God feels more urgent about ensuring Lebensraum for his favorite tribe than stopping the horrors of mass extermination.
Remember that he's not commanding Israel to simply go in and kill innocent people. Rather, these are incredibly wicked, abominable people who had committed capital crimes and whose just desert was death.
This idea that an entire society, down to the man, woman, and child, can be so wicked that they all deserve mass extermination is one of our most barbaric, simplified ways of identifying evil and deciding how to deal with it. The fact that it exists in the Bible is a damning indicator of the book's inability to articulate even basic philosophical or moral insight, and the fact that Craig wields it as a justification for anything says the same about him.
And God had given them centuries to repent and change. He says to Abraham, I'm not going to give the promised land to you yet, because the iniquity of the Amorites, the people in the land, is not yet complete. And so he allowed his own people to languish for 400 years in Israel before their wickedness had become so irreversible, so abominable, that they were now ripe for judgment.
Or, hear me out, this is an ancient society's flattering explanation for why it wasn't able to overcome its rival sooner?
And God used the Israeli army as a tool of his judgment upon the Canaanite tribes by driving them out of the land and divesting them of the promised land and giving the land over to Israel. And I see absolutely no reason to think that God couldn't order something like that with respect to some nation of incredible wickedness today.
Well, I sure hope he could see a reason, because he's deeply disturbed if he can't. And his suggestion that such a vividly horrible thing would be okay is a clumsy misstep that I hope at least deep down doesn't sit well with his audience. By the way, you know which side did consider an entire society so irredeemably wicked that it needed to be exterminated? I'll give you a hint, Craig. It wasn't the Allies. Maybe think about that before bringing World War II into an analogy. This is a prime example of something Craig used to be good at, which is slipping in words that subtly change the meaning of what he's talking about so he can create ambiguity about what he's arguing for. The problem is he did it so obviously here he kind of just tripped over himself and fell on his face. Let's look at another example of him doing the same thing. This one titled, Do Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence?
It sounds so commonsensical, doesn't it, to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence if you were to believe them. That sounds so right.
Yeah, it kind of does. But we have to be careful here, because we're dealing with a saying that sounds right because of how it was constructed, namely in the repetition of the word extraordinary to modify both the words claims and evidence. But this repetition is just a tool used to make the saying pithy, not the epistemological basis for the idea being expressed. In other words, skeptics don't accept it just because it sounds right. They accept it because they recognize the truth that runs deeper than and has nothing to do with a choice of phrasing. What we mean when we say a claim is extraordinary is that it proposes something that's apparently far-fetched because it appears to have no precedent in our body of experience. We generally have good reason to believe things that seem to line up with reality as we've observed it so far, and we're generally going to be slow to believe something that has little to no precedent, meaning it's going to take more thorough observation not only to convince us the thing happened, but to help us understand its attributes and incorporate it into our picture of reality. This greater level of verification is what we call extraordinary evidence. And yes, if you look past the phrasing and grant a charitable reading of what this saying means, it's clear that every person, other than those suffering from crippling credulity, I guess, requires extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. Tell Craig you have a dog that flies and shoots lasers from its eyes, and some form of the extraordinary claims requires extraordinary evidence principle will dominate his reaction. For good reason. Like most Christians, he gets and agrees with the actual principle until it applies to his religion. But of course we all know he's going to dodge by shifting definitions now that it is applied to his religion. What's crazy, though, is what an obviously bad job he does of it. Just watch and see.
But in fact, I think it's demonstrably false. It is simply not true that highly improbable events require extraordinary evidence in order to believe in them.
Did you catch that? He switched from extraordinary to highly improbable. Just to make it clear, watch how obvious it was.
It sounds so commonsensical, doesn't it, to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence if you were to believe them. That sounds so right. But in fact, I think it's demonstrably false. It is simply not true that highly improbable events require extraordinary evidence in order to believe in them.
And it actually gets much worse.
And probability theorists realized this. From the time of Condorcet through John Stuart Mill, probability theorists debated over what it would take to establish the reality of a highly improbable event.
I just want to quickly point out here that Craig, per his usual style, is bringing up names and quotes that will wow his audience. And I guess that's generally okay and kind of expected. But he's referring to what they say about statistically improbable events, not the kind of far-fetched, unprecedented events we refer to as extraordinary. So it's just kind of pointless name-dropping.
And they realized very quickly that if you require that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, then we would be prevented from believing many ordinary but highly improbable events that happen all the time.
So, okay. After switching from extraordinary to improbable, Craig took it just a step further to ordinary but highly improbable events.
And they realized very quickly that if you require that extraordinary events require extraordinary evidence, then we would be prevented from believing many ordinary but highly improbable events that happen all the time.
He just told us in as many words that he's talking about ordinary, meaning the opposite of extraordinary, events. He's become so bad at equivocation that he used a direct antonym for the word he's trying to fudge on. Geez, he's making my job way too easy. And in case you think I'm splitting hairs over his phrasing, listen to the illustration he uses.
For example, suppose you hear on the evening news an announcement of the pick in last night's lottery. Now that's an enormously improbable event, one chance out of millions, perhaps. And yet, you would never need to have extraordinary evidence that was more probable than that in order to believe in it rationally.
Yeah, so two major problems with this. First, winning the lottery is not an extraordinary event in the way that skeptics use the phrase, or, more importantly, in a way that parallels God and the supernatural being extraordinary. We have repeated precedent of people winning lotteries, and the mechanics of every step in the process is totally natural and comprehensible. In other words, it's the kind of ordinary but improbable event that Craig just admitted he changed the subject to talking about. What's more, Craig's pointing out an announcement that somebody eventually won the lottery, a high probability, almost inevitable event, rather than the actual low probability event of a specific person winning. I mean, compare your reaction to hearing a lottery announcement on TV to your reaction to someone you sat next to on the bus telling you he won the lottery. They're two totally different things that you'd probably have different inclinations to believe. So after changing the subject, Craig failed to make even the wrong point.
So what probability theorists came to see is that you need to consider not only the intrinsic probability of the event, but you also need to determine the ratio between the probability of the evidence that we have, given that the event occurred, versus the probability of that evidence if the event did not occur. And if that ratio weights in favor of saying the evidence is vastly more probable if the event occurred than if it did not, then that can serve to counterbalance any intrinsic improbability in the event itself.
If Craig's not literally describing an argument from ignorance here, he's at least making the justification for applying thin arguments from ignorance to apologetics, which is the foundation for his whole shtick of claiming to deduce that implausible, unobserved events are more likely than unlikely. Anyway, for our final example, let's take a look at what Craig's doing with one of his most famous go-tos, the moral argument. In this video, he tries to explain why morality is grounded in God rather than existing outside Him. Here's what he has to say in response to an audience member's question.
And I would say two things in response to this. First of all, it may well be the case that any moral view will have its explanatory stopping point, its ultimate, beyond which you cannot go. There will be simply an explanatory ultimate.
Now, this thing about every moral explanation having an explanatory ultimate is an interesting concession on Craig's part. Generally, when apologists appeal to God as a grounding for morality, atheists point out that morality can be grounded in empathy or our obligation to other people. The dumb criticism of this observation is that empathy, human flourishing, or our sense of obligation to people is arbitrary, and that you can't argue to an inevitable conclusion why human flourishing is good or you should behave decently toward other people. Of course, people generally agree on the benefits of these things, but you can't construct an objective logical argument for them any more than you can construct an objective logical argument for why it's better to in the toilet than on the floor, or why it's best not to stick shards of glass in your eye. These are things we pretty much all understand, even though we'll reach an explanatory stopping point in our ability to explain the logic behind them. Usually at the point where someone starts asking you dumb questions about why suffering is bad or happiness is good. What I find interesting is that, while theists will criticize us for reaching this stopping point, or explanatory ultimate, I guess, in grounding morality and obligation to humans, Craig is acknowledging that this same explanatory stopping point applies to using God as a basis for morality. To the same extent and for the same reasons that you can't logically argue the conclusion that being nice to humans is moral by definition, you can't logically argue the conclusion that obeying God is moral by definition. While this is obviously true, it's a surprising thing for Craig to concede, as it seems to undercut most people's understanding of the moral argument. But let's see where he goes from here.
And what I would say is that God is a less arbitrary and more plausible explanatory stopping point than anything else the atheist can suggest, such as the flourishing of sentient life, the flourishing of human beings. On atheism, those stopping points are arbitrary and, I think, premature. Whereas when you get to God, you've reached a metaphysical ultimate beyond which you cannot go, and so it is a more plausible explanatory stopping point.
So the flourishing of humans or sentient life is an arbitrary stopping point. Interesting. But did you catch why God is a more logical stopping point? Probably not, because his answer was just a vague, convoluted assertion that makes no sense. Listen again in case you didn't catch it.
Whereas when you get to God, you've reached a metaphysical ultimate beyond which you cannot go, and so it is a more plausible explanatory stopping point.
If we're to be generous enough to sift through this word salad for signs of meaning before throwing it in the trash, we'll find nothing but questions. What does a metaphysical ultimate even mean, much less have to do with explaining morality? How did Craig determine you can go no further than God in this explanation? Why is God a more plausible explanatory stopping point? Even if you can't lay out an airtight logical argument for the value of human flourishing, humans are a better logical stopping point than God for explaining morality for two simple reasons. The first is that, they obviously exist. I mean, that really helps kick things off, right? And second is that, while human flourishing is hard to argue logically, at least to sociopaths or people who want to be pedantic, humanity can generally agree on its value. God, on the other hand, has disadvantages on both of these fronts in that he lacks evident existence, and any statement about what he wants is arbitrary assertion. I'd argue that the only intelligible way to determine what's moral is to assess who you're living alongside and how your actions impact them. Sure, the best you can do might be to reach a conclusion based on empathy, your experience, and the feedback you get from them, and from there you might eventually have to shrug and say just because when someone asks you to explain it logically. But stopping there seems to recognize the actual terminus of your ability to reason through it. Supposing an additional being exists, and then answering just because to the question of why you should hypothetically behave certain ways toward it based on what it hypothetically wants, might feel like taking an additional step forward. But it's just a step forward into make-believe that doesn't delve any further down into the logic of the issue. In the end, this comes shockingly close to an admission that all the idea of God does is let us revert back to childhood and enjoy the simplified clarity of having one person in charge to appeal to. Now, Craig does go on to explain further, but all he does is make it worse. And I mean way worse. Just listen.
The second thing, though, I think I would say is this. Suppose you say that the reason we should obey God's commands is because he has commanded us to. In other words, God's commands are self-inclusive. If God has said, obey all that I command you, then that is itself something that he has commanded us. And so it would be comprised in itself. And it seems to me that this is a perfectly legitimate justification for saying why we should obey God, because he has commanded us to, and our moral duties are constituted by his commands. So I think it's a kind of self-inclusive or self-justifying stopping point.
Yep. He's literally saying the reason you should obey God is because God says so. That's his actual logical argument. This, my dear friends, is the illustrious William Lane Craig. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, A Little Logic, S.R. Foxley, The Crowd Pleaser, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.